This story takes place way back in 1864, during the Second Schleswig War. There's this guy named John, his wife Marie, their son Creston, and John's brother Peter. They're all from Denmark, and they decide to make a big change in their lives by moving to the United States. Their plan was pretty straightforward. They'd get seats on a stagecoach to take them to their new home. But here's the twist. Peter, John's brother, decides to stay in Denmark. Now, as they're all settled into the coach, there's a surprise. Out of the blue, this guy pops his head inside and tells another couple to get off the coach. So, the couple leaves, and in their place, two guys who had just gotten out of jail, Paul and Lester, hop on board. At first glance, Paul and Lester look pretty relaxed and not bothered by anything. Marie and Creston couldn't talk in English yet, so John decided to show them the house he made for them. He made sure Creston felt comfortable there. Later on, when they were having a drink together, one of the guys offered a drink to Marie, telling her to have some. At first, Marie said no, but John convinced her to relax and have a sip. John told them about his wife and son, who couldn't speak English either, and answered their questions, even though he didn't have to. But there was something strange about the way the two guys were looking at Marie. John asked Paul to stop, and that made Paul feel like John was threatening him. Suddenly, Lester pulled out a gun and pointed it at John's face. Meanwhile, Paul pulled Marie onto his lap, making fun of John and saying he couldn't do anything about it. John saw an opportunity and quickly took away Lester's gun while pulling out his own. He told Creston to grab Lester's gun, but Lester grabbed Creston and had a knife close to him. Paul then pulled out two guns, and it got pretty intense. Paul gave John just 5 seconds to get off the couch, or else they'd harm both Creston and Marie. With no other option, John let go of his gun, and Paul pushed him off the couch. John didn't give up, though. He started running after the coach, even though he couldn't catch up. John ran through the night for what felt like a very long time, until he came across a little shack. There was no one inside, but he saw a heartbreaking sight in the distance. Creston's lifeless body lying on the ground. John couldn't hold back his tears as he picked up his little boy and continued walking. Then he saw the coach driver and the guard lying dead in front of the coach, and he gently placed Creston down. He found a nearby gun and cautiously approached the coach. He saw one of the men inside and skillfully shot Lester right between the eyes. Paul tried to run away, crying and begging for his life, saying that Marie was still alive. John didn't say a word. He started loading Paul with bullets, making sure he used up all his bullets on him. After that, John carried his wife and son back to their home. Peter heard the news and rushed over to find his nephew and sister-in-law lifeless. He stood by his brother, trying to support him as he cried. It turns out Paul was the brother of a notorious gang leader and landowner named Henry Delarue. When Henry heard the news, he and his small group of men rode into the small town of Black Creek. Mayor Keene assured Henry that nobody in their small town had anything to do with his men or his brother's deaths. But Henry didn't pay attention and went inside to see the bodies. He demanded to know if they had caught the killer. Sheriff Malik was scared but told Henry that it wasn't anyone from their town and they had no idea who did it. Henry grimly gave them 2 hours to bring the killer to him alive. If they refused, he threatened to take revenge on 2 townspeople. If they still didn't comply, Henry promised to kill 4 people himself. The next day around noon, Mayor Keene chose 2 townspeople. One was an old woman who had come to terms with her fate, and the other was a man with no legs who pleaded for his life. Without wasting any time, Henry shot the man who was begging right there. He then walked over to the old woman, who cursed him before Henry shot her in the face without any hesitation. Henry took a brief pause, but he still wasn't satisfied. He shot another man point blank in the face, complaining that dealing with just one old woman and a man with half his body missing didn't quench his thirst for revenge. It turns out that Black Creek had been paying Henry $80 for protection, but now he wanted $160 by the end of the month, leaving the mayor wondering where he would find the extra money. Henry buried Paul, and his widow Madeleine, who couldn't speak, attended the funeral. He promised her he'd get revenge, but she just wanted peace and told him to be quiet. After burying his family, John and Peter brought their belongings to town to sell so they could leave. Peter went to the shop run by the old woman and met her grandson Wojciech, who informed him about her passing. Peter wanted to sell some animal skins, and when Wojciech learned they were hunters, he thought their skills could help protect the town from Henry's men. Peter advised the boy not to pick fights he couldn't win, but Wojciech called him a coward. John went to see Mayor Keene, hoping to sell his land. However, he found out that he could only get $140 for it, which was half of what he had paid 6 years ago. Mayor Keene explained that because of Henry's fees, he couldn't offer more than $150. He mentioned that if they could find the person who killed Henry's brother, things might improve. John was confused until he realized that Paul was Henry's brother, which made him realize the danger he was in. So John accepted the $150, and Mayor Keene warned him to hide the money in his boots to avoid being robbed. As John was leaving, he noticed that he was surrounded by armed men. It turned out to be the townsfolk led by Sheriff Malik, who suddenly shot John from his horse. Meanwhile, Henry and Madeleine met with the Standard Atlantic Oil Company, and it was revealed that with Mayor Keene's help, Henry had been buying land in Black Creek and the surrounding area, which was rich in crude oil. Henry found out that the oil company had intercepted a message from the sheriff asking for help dealing with Henry. He reminded the company that he wasn't dealing with Indians and demanded that their methods match the company's image. John was locked up in jail, and later Peter was brought in by some men, roughed up, and thrown into a cell. When they were alone, John pleaded with Sheriff Malik to let Peter go, as he was innocent. However, Malik wanted Peter to pay for injuring his deputy while being captured. He had also informed Henry about John's capture, hoping that it might save their little town. Malik acknowledged that Henry used to be a good man, but had become cruel after harming Native American tribes. He apologized to John for his loss and believed that if John had shown compassion to Henry's brother, it might have saved them a lot of trouble. Malik hoped that John's death would buy them some time until he got help from the federal government, unaware that his message had been intercepted. The next day, the townspeople gathered and dragged John out of jail. They beat him up and threw him over a horse, then rode away with him while no one dared to intervene or say a word. They brought John to their base and tied him to a post. Henry and Madeleine came out to see him, introducing him to Madeleine as the man who killed her husband. But John made it clear that Paul had killed his little boy and harmed his wife. Henry didn't care and was eager to see what John was made of, having heard that he used to be a soldier. He left John tied up in the sun. Soon Mayor Keene arrived at the base. Before meeting with Henry, he coldly took John's boots off, telling him he wouldn't need the money where he was going. Back in Black Creek, Peter overheard Sheriff Malik saying he'd be held back at Mass. It was the same guard Peter had taunted before, so he started making fun of him, saying no woman would want him with that face. The guard couldn't take it anymore and rushed at Peter, but John grabbed his feet and knocked him out. Meanwhile, Henry was causing trouble for Madeleine, and she wasn't happy about it, especially because it wasn't consensual. That evening, it started raining heavily, and John was still tied up. Nearby, Peter had his eye on John and was planning his escape. One guard left his post to grab a cup of coffee inside, only to return and find the man missing. He pulled out his gun and went to investigate, but Peter silently killed him with a blade. Peter then freed John and lifted his weakened brother onto his shoulder. 2 guards almost discovered them, but Peter shot the men dead. The other guards opened fire, but Peter managed to escape with John on horseback. As they made their way, John was too weak to ride on his own and too heavy to carry, so Peter hid him and promised to return, leaving him with a rifle. Henry and his men were chasing them on horseback, and Peter planned to lead them on as long as possible. However, the men noticed a split in the tracks, so they divided to track down both Peter and John. The next day, John woke up and quenched his thirst when he heard horses approaching. He took cover and grabbed his rifle just as Henry and his men passed by. To John's shock, they were dragging Peter's lifeless body behind them. Henry returned to his base only to find all the men he had left behind dead and all his money gone. He realized that Madeleine had robbed him. Madeleine managed to board a train with a bag of cash, eagerly awaiting its departure. The train started moving, and Madeleine felt relieved until she saw Henry's gang racing toward the train, which came to a stop shortly after. She got up, pulled out a gun, and ran to the back car, but the men surrounded her. John was wandering through the countryside when he came across a small house belonging to Mrs. Whistler, whose husband had been killed by Henry. Mrs. Whistler spotted him and grabbed her gun, but realized that John was just looking for water. She took him to the barn to rest and offered him some food and water. Mrs. Whistler and her family were about to leave their home and offered to take John with them, but he declined, wanting to regain his strength because he had work to do. Eventually, Henry's men brought Madeleine back to him, but she defiantly stared at him, even after he backhanded her. Henry planned to kill her, but allowed his gang to mistreat her before ordering them to threaten her with a blade to her throat. Once John was arrested, he went straight to the mayor's house, held the frightened man at gunpoint, and demanded his boots and the cash he had taken. John also demanded that Mayor Keene hand over his deed, and wondered why the mayor had visited Henry, realizing that the mayor was working with Henry. John forced Keene to open a coffin he was working on and roughed him up, ordering him to get inside. Keene was terrified, begging John. John locked him inside the coffin and left him there. He then went to Wojciech's shop to buy guns, ammo, and bottles of kerosene. John told Wojciech to inform Sheriff Malik about Keene and Henry's plan to buy out Black Creek for the oil, but Wojciech wanted to fight. John left with his weapons, ready to start a war. At Henry's base, tension ran high as a cart pulled in, carrying a coffin. They opened it, and it revealed Mayor Keene inside. However, Henry ordered his men to burn Keene, as he had plans to use the coffin for John. In the distance, they noticed a big fire and someone shooting at them. It turned out to be Wojciech, creating a diversion for John. Another fire broke out at the barn, and when one man went to check, John ambushed and killed him. Now the whole base was on high alert, with even Henry grabbing a rifle, unsure of where the attack was coming from. Wojciech followed orders and climbed onto a roof. After mustering his courage, he shot a man in the stomach, causing him to stumble away. Wojciech tried to move but ended up getting shot himself. The men inside the building heard him on the roof and started firing, hitting Wojciech. They then saw gasoline pouring down on them. One man, who was smoking a cigarette, instantly caught on fire, and his friend had to put him out of his misery. John saw Wojciech's lifeless body and felt regret. Then he noticed a gangster dragging Madeleine out of the room. John aimed carefully and dropped the man from the roof, saving Madeleine and shooting the man dead. He didn't realize there was another man nearby, and he got hit by gunfire. Seeing John in trouble, Henry also came out, planning to take advantage of the situation. One of Henry's men started shooting through the floorboards and then peeked out, but he met a gruesome end with a knife to the eye from John. As the injured man staggered away, John brutally finished him off with his blade. Suddenly, Henry shot John in the shoulder, and John fell. Henry approached him and started his villainous speech, but Madeleine showed up and took swift action, shooting Henry in the chest. John finished Henry with a shot to the head. Both John and Madeleine pointed their guns at each other, but Madeleine chose to walk away. Later, John was getting ready to leave when Sheriff Malik and his men rode into town, passing by the dead gang members and Henry. Sheriff Malik thanked John for ending their suffering, but grew wary when he saw Madeleine with him. They aimed their guns at John, and he warned the sheriff to leave to avoid meeting a similar fate as Henry. John and Madeleine left the town together, and it was revealed that the oil company eventually took control of the town. So the moral of the story is never mess with a man's boots or his cash. It might just lead to a Wild West showdown.